I have an assortment of testimonies from medical personnel during World War II. I love the resources I used to get these, being www.meddepartment.com. May have another video using these accounts. They're really cool to read through. Alright, let's get started. Richard Doc Felix was born in New York City in 1925 and grew up during the Great Depression. Before entering military service, he attended the College of New York, where he studied advertising and marketing. Unlike many young men who enter the Army immediately after high school, Felix had already completed 3 years of college before he was drafted. His educational background would later help him build a successful post-war career in business, eventually completing both his BBA and MBA through the GI Bill after the war. Felix entered the Army on July 13, 1943. After induction, he was sent to the Medical Replacement Training Center at Camp Grant, Illinois, one of the Army's largest facilities dedicated to training medical personnel. Camp Grant became the foundation of his medical career. During approximately 6 months of combined basic and medical training, Felix learned the fundamentals of battlefield medicine. Training emphasized stop bleeding, prevented shock, controlling the infection, applying all right dressings to chest wounds, splinting fractures, administering sulfa drugs, and using morphine syringes. Felix later recalled that nearly half of his training focused on understanding the human body and the effects of combat wounds. He learned not only how bullets and shell fragments damaged tissue, but also how pain influenced morale and shock. Morphine became one of the most important tools in his medical kit. He specifically remembered the widespread use of morphine syringes and Blue 88s, otherwise known as Amital, which I've discussed in a previous video. However, instructors emphasized that morphine could not be used in all situations. For example, stomach wounds often required avoiding morphine because it could worsen the bleeding. Because morphine was valuable and addictive, medics guarded their supplies carefully. Felix trained alongside men who had worked as hospital orderlies before the war, allowing him to learn practical medical skills from experienced personnel as well as military instructors. After completing medical training, Felix entered the Ranger Replacement System. Ranger service demanded far more than ordinary infantry duty. Medics assigned to Ranger units were expected to keep pace with elite assault troops while carrying sufficient quantities of medical equipment. Unlike rear area medical personnel, Ranger medics had to reach casualties while under direct enemy fire. Throughout 1944, Felix continued preparing for overseas service while the 5th Ranger Battalion was earning fame in Normandy and northern France. Felix was still progressing through the replacement and training pipeline. By the time he joined the battalion overseas, the Rangers had already participated in some of the most famous actions of the war, including Pointe du Hoc and the Normandy campaign. Felix later served with the battalion during the Rhineland and Ardennes, Alsace, and Central Europe campaigns. When Felix arrived in Europe, he entered a battlefield dominated by artillery. As a Ranger medic, he attached to Company D, 5th Ranger Battalion. He quickly learned that artillery, mortars, and rockets often produce more casualties than rifle fire. His daily responsibilities included controlling hemorrhages, administering morphine, applying field dressing, preventing shock, and coordinating evacuations to battalion aid stations. The Rangers operated as highly mobile assault troops, which meant medics frequently had to move through dangerous terrain carrying wounded soldiers. Unlike physicians working in hospitals, Felix often treated casualties within sight of the enemy. Every evacuation involved balancing speed against personal risk. Felix's most famous action occurred during the Zerf-Irsch operation in Germany on February 28, 1945. T Company came under intense German artillery and rocket fire during the bombardment. Tree bursts exploded overhead, sending deadly fragments in all directions. Felix himself was knocked unconscious by concussion from the blasts. When he regained consciousness, he discovered that PFC Persley Vinning, I don't know how to pronounce that, had suffered severe facial wounds from shrapnel. Despite enemy fire continuing, Felix moved to Ving, controlled the bleeding, and physically carried him out of the impact area. He then carried the wounded Ranger approximately 3/4 of a mile to the battalion aid station. The effort earned him both the Bronze Star and the Purple Heart. Ving survived, underwent extensive reconstructive surgery, and reportedly recovered well, although Felix never saw him again after the war. After spending one night in a field hospital, Felix returned to Company D the very next day to continue serving as a medic. Following the reserve operation, the battalion moved into Luxembourg to recover and receive replacements. Nearly 200 new men arrived to replace losses. While stationed there, Felix witnessed the transition from offensive combat operations to occupation and security duties. Rangers guarded displaced person camps, warehouses, supply depots, and transportation routes while continuing their advance into Germany. On March 9, 1945, the battalion moved to Trier, Germany. Felix and the Rangers spent much of their time conducting police duties and searching for remaining German soldiers. One of the most significant events of the period occurred on April 16th, when the battalion escorted German civilians through the recently liberated Buchenwald concentration camp. Like many American soldiers, Felix was confronted with the reality of Nazi atrocity. By May of 1945, the Rangers had crossed into Austria. Combat operations were winding down as Germany collapsed. The battalion spent its final weeks guarding prisoner-of-war compounds and performing occupation duties. Felix reflected that during the campaigns he served in, the battalion suffered 116 killed, 552 wounded, and 72 missing or captured. After VE Day, Felix's responsibilities changed dramatically. Instead of treating combat casualties, he helped restore normal life in occupied Germany and Austria. Rangers patrolled highways, guarded facilities, and assisted in maintaining public order. Felix specifically remembered serving on Autobahn patrols and helping restore services to local populations. In August 1945, he began the long trip home through the famous cigarette camps in France, including Lucky Strike and Old Gold. Eventually, he boarded the British-crewed SSC Spine and sailed for Boston after processing through Camp Miles Standish at Fort Dix. He received an honorable discharge on October 26, 1945. Reflecting on his service, Felix wrote that he entered the army as a 19-year-old boy and emerged 1 year, 9 months, and 6 days later as a grown man. Eugene J. Glazer was born in New York City in 1924 and grew up during the Great Depression. Like many young Americans of his generation, he came of age during the uncertainty of the interwar years and entered adulthood as the United States became deeply involved in World War II. Following induction into the military service in April of 1943, Glazer entered the Army Medical Department and was sent to Camp Pickett, Virginia, home of one of the many Army Medical Replacement Training Centers. Here he began training as a medical technician and specifically designated to provide the Army with skilled enlisted personnel capable of caring for wounded soldiers in both hospitals and evacuation systems. Camp Pickett's medical technician course was intensive. Glazer studied anatomy, physiology, sanitation, communicable diseases, ward management, patient healing, and emergency treatment procedures. He later recalled that the Army had explained the course from 8 weeks to 12 weeks because of the earlier program did not provide sufficient practical experience. Students spent long hours learning how the human body functioned, how disease spread, and how to care for patients suffering from trauma, infection, and surgical complications. After completing training, Glazer was assigned to Hospital Train Number 13 and later Hospital Train Number 7. These units formed an essential but often overlooked component of the Army's evacuation chain. That's why I made a video on this in the past. Wounded soldiers who suffered treatment at field hospitals and evacuation hospitals still needed transportation to larger medical centers further behind the front. Hospital trains functioned as rolling hospitals equipped with doctors, nurses, technicians, medications, and specialized facilities capable of caring for hundreds of patients simultaneously. In 1944, as Allied forces advanced through France, following the Normandy breakout, hospital trains became increasingly important. as casualties from France, Belgium, and Germany flooded into the evacuation system. Glazer found himself responsible for caring for men suffering from every imaginable wound. The train cars were crowded with soldiers recovering from surgery, men with shattered limbs, severe burns, infections, and debilitating illness. Unlike frontline medics who saw patients for minutes or hours, Glazer often cared for patients over extended journeys, monitoring their condition, administering medications, changing dressings, and providing comfort. Many soldiers spoke openly about their fears, worries, and uncertainty regarding their futures. The Battle of the Bulge created one of the greatest medical crises Glazer encountered. Hundreds of casualties entered the evacuation system, suffering not only from combat wounds, but also from severe frostbite caused by their bitter winter conditions. Glazer repeatedly cared for soldiers terrified that gangrene would force amputation of fingers, feet, hands, or entire limbs. He vividly remembered the smell of then gangrene, describing it as one of the most unforgettable aspects of his wartime service. Everard Raymond Hicks was born on February 24, 1919, in Hazel, Kentucky. Medicine played a major role in his family history. Several relatives worked as physicians, creating an environment that encouraged medical service. After high school, Hicks attended college before enrolling at William Mason Memorial Hospital School of Nursing. He graduated as a registered nurse in 1941, a rare qualification for a young man at the time. Hicks entered military service in February of 1942. Because of his nursing qualifications, the Army immediately recognized his medical experience and assigned him to medical training. He attended Camp Berkeley, Texas, where he learned Army medical procedures and administrative responsibilities. Hicks was initially assigned to the artillery of the 7th Infantry Division. During this period, he participated in large-scale desert training exercises in the Mojave Desert. These maneuvers were designed to prepare troops for combat under harsh conditions and expose medical personnel to the realities of caring for soldiers in extreme environments. Hicks treated dehydration, heart-related illnesses, injuries, and training accidents while gaining valuable experience in military medicine. The 99th Infantry Division arrived in Europe shortly before the German Ardennes offensive. Hicks suddenly found himself treating casualties amidst one of the most intensive battles fought by American forces during the war. The freezing weather, constant artillery bombardment, and massive casualty rates changed every aspect of Army medicine. Hicks administered plasma, treated shock, dressed wounds, and coordinated evacuation under difficult conditions. He frequently worked long hours with little rest while attempting to save lives. One of Hicks' most remarkable actions occurred when 2 wounded soldiers became trapped in a minefield. Despite the danger, he carefully followed their footprints through the minefield, reached the casualties, and successfully evacuated them. As Allied forces entered Germany, Hicks increasingly treated German soldiers and civilians. He recalled that many German wounded actively sought treatment from Americans because they believed American medical care was superior. Hicks administered plasma and emergency care regardless of nationality, demonstrating the humanitarian responsibilities that often accompany military medicine. Following the German surrender, he participated in occupation duties while continuing to provide medical care. Margaret Marie Eggert was born on August 16, 1915, in Detroit, Michigan. Growing up during the First World War and the Great Depression, she developed an interest in nursing at an early age. After completing her education, she entered professional nursing training and graduated from nursing school in 1937. Rather than immediately entering military service, Eggert spent several years building her civilian nursing career, seeking additional specialization. She attended the prestigious Salone Hospital for Women in New York City, where she received advanced training in, I don't know how to pronounce that word. Following America's entry into the war, Eggert decided to volunteer for military service. She entered the Army Nurse Corps and was called to active duty on January 4, 1943. Like many nurses entering military service, she had to adjust from civilian hospitals to military medicine. Although she already possessed extensive nursing experience, military service introduced new requirements, including Army procedures, military discipline, and wartime medical organization. Her first assignment sent her to Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, where she continued nursing for work while simultaneously learning how military hospitals operated. At Camp McCoy, Eggert worked primarily in obstetrics and general nursing. During this period, she cared for military families and soldiers while adapting to Army life. Like many nurses eager to contribute directly to the war effort, she hoped for overseas service initially. However, Army regulations concerning vision standards prevented her from receiving an overseas assignment. This disappointment was significant because many Army nurses viewed overseas duty as both a professional challenge and a patriotic obligation. Eventually, the restrictions were overcome when she transferred to the 250th Hospital Station. The transfer to the 250th Station Hospital changed the course of Eggert's wartime career. Station hospitals were designed to provide long-term treatment and recovery care rather than frontline emergency medicine. Eggert was assigned to Contagious Disease Ward, an area requiring specialized knowledge and strict infection control procedures. Diseases remained a major threat during World War II, and contagious disease wards frequently treated patients suffering from illness that could spread rapidly among military populations. Her work required a careful observation, isolation procedures, medication administration, and continuous patient monitoring. In December of 1943, Eggert departed from the United States with the 250th Station Hospital and crossed the Atlantic to England. Like many medical personnel traveling overseas, she faced uncertainty about what conditions she would encounter. Upon arrival, the hospital became part of the massive Allied medical buildup preparing for the invasion of Europe. For months before D-Day, military hospitals throughout Britain expanded the facilities and stockpiled supplies in anticipation of enormous casualty numbers. Eggert and her fellow nurses spent long hours preparing wards, organizing equipment, and ensuring the hospital could receive wounded soldiers when the invasion began. Following D-Day and the subsequent campaigns in France, Belgium, and Germany, casualties began flowing through Allied hospitals in large numbers. Eggert cared for patients suffering from combat wounds, illnesses, infections, and post-operative complications. Unlike frontline medics who often saw patients only briefly, nurses like Eggert spent extended periods caring for recovering soldiers. They monitored vital signs, administered medications, changed dressings, provided emotional support, and often served as a primary link between wounded soldiers and their families back home. As Allied armies advancing into Germany, the 250th Station Hospital eventually moved from England to continental Europe. Eggert found herself serving in former German medical facilities that had been taken over by Allied forces. This transition exposed her to the aftermath of the war in a way many Americans ever experienced. She encountered displaced persons, refugees, former prisoners, and civilians attempting to rebuild their lives after the conflict. Florence Evangeline Blauvelt, often known as Vangie, was born in Nova Scotia, Canada in 1921. Her family moved to Massachusetts, where she spent most of her childhood and adolescence. Growing up during the Great Depression, she witnessed economic hardship and social change, experiences shared by many members of the generation that would later serve in World War II. After completing high school, Blauvelt pursued nursing and entered formal nursing training. She graduated in September of 1942, entering the profession at a time where military demand for nurses was rapidly increasing. Shortly after graduation, Blauvelt and several classmates decided to volunteer for military service together. The decision reflected both patriotism and a desire to remain together during wartime. She entered the Army Nurse Corps in 1943 as a second lieutenant. Like many newly commissioned nurses, she transitioned directly from civilian nursing into military medicine. Blauvelt's first assignment was Fort Devens, Massachusetts, where she cared for soldiers returning from overseas deployments, particularly in the Pacific Theater. Many of these patients suffered from malaria and other tropical diseases during combat operations, which I've talked about Navy Corpsmen in a previous video. This experience exposed Blauvelt to one of the most significant medical challenges of the Pacific War. Unlike dramatic battlefield wounds, malaria represented a persistent threat that incapacitated thousands of soldiers. Despite the importance of her work at Fort Devens, Blauvelt wanted to contribute more directly to the war effort. She volunteered for overseas duty and eventually received orders assigning her to the 136th Station Hospital. Overseas, service required leaving behind familiar surroundings and entering an uncertain environment where nurses frequently worked long hours under difficult conditions. Like many Army nurses, she viewed overseas service both as a professional challenge and a personal responsibility. Thank you for watching. This is my late June 6th video. Oops, this took longer than I thought it would. Well, if you want to see more, click the videos on the left and the right, and have a great day.